Okay, gather close. Dim the lights if you can. What I'm about to share isn't fiction. It's a tapestry woven from documented accounts, police reports, and the chilling whispers of history. Welcome, dear viewers, to Darkling Fables. I'm so glad you've joined me tonight. Prepare yourselves, because the story we're delving into is one of profound darkness, a true event that chills the blood and lingers in the mind long after the telling is done. Lean in, listen closely, and let the shadows of the past envelop you. Ourselves in Bavaria, Germany. The year is 1922. The Great War has left scars across the land, not just physical ones, but deep psychological wounds. People are trying to rebuild, to find normalcy in a world that feels fractured. But normalcy is a fragile thing, especially in isolated places. Our story unfolds on a small, remote farmstead known as Hinterkaifeck. The name itself sounds a bit like a half-forgotten folktale, doesn't it? It wasn't even a proper village. Just this one farm, set apart, about halfway between the towns of Ingolstadt and Schrobenhausen. Imagine it, fields stretching out, maybe a patch of woods nearby, but essentially alone. Miles from the nearest neighbor, significant enough to hear a scream over the wind. Living on this farm was the Gruber family. The patriarch was Andreas Gruber, a man in his 60s, known in the area as, well, let's just say he had a reputation. Stern, perhaps difficult. Some whispered darker things, but those are whispers, and we deal in what we know. With him lived his wife Casilia, also in her 70s. Then there was their widowed daughter, Victoria Gabriel, in her mid-30s. Victoria had 2 children, 7-year-old Casilia, named after her grandmother, and little Joseph, just 2 years old. Finally, there was the maid, Maria Baumgartner, who had only started working there very recently, just hours before our story reaches its dreadful climax. Life on a farm like Hinterkaifeck was hard, relentless work. Sunrise to sunset, dictated by the seasons and the needs of the animals. But beneath the surface of this rural routine, something was deeply wrong. A quiet dread had begun to settle over the farmstead, like a persistent fog clinging to the low ground. It started subtly, as these things often do. The previous maid, whose name is lost to us now, had left abruptly about 6 months earlier. She hadn't just quit, she practically fled. Why? She claimed the place was haunted. She spoke of hearing strange noises, footsteps echoing from the attic when no one should have been there, whispers in empty rooms, a feeling of being watched. The Grubers, practical farming folk, likely dismissed it as nerves or imagination. An isolated farm can play tricks on the mind after all. They needed help, so they eventually hired Maria Baumgartner. Her first day, tragically, would also be her last. But the strange occurrences didn't leave with the old maid. If anything, they intensified. Andreas Gruber, despite his stern exterior, wasn't immune to the growing unease. He started noticing things himself. One cold day, likely in March of 1922, he told neighbors about discovering a set of footprints in the fresh snow. These weren't animal tracks. They were human footprints, leading from the edge of the nearby forest, directly towards the farmhouse. What was truly unsettling, there was no second set of tracks leading away. It was as if someone had walked out of the woods, approached the house, and then vanished. Andreas searched the property, checked the barns, the sheds. Nothing. No one. Just the silent testimony of the footprints in the snow, slowly being erased by the wind. Sleep became a scarce commodity at Hinterkaifeck. The family started hearing those noises the previous maid had spoken of, distinct footsteps coming from the attic, creaks and groans that couldn't be explained away by the old house settling or the wind whistling through the eaves. Andreas, armed perhaps with a lamp and his own growing fear, climbed up to investigate. The attic was empty. Dust motes danced in the lamplight, silence pressed in. Yet the sounds persisted on other nights. Were they imagining it? Was the isolation finally getting to them? Or was someone, somehow, moving through their home, unseen? Then came another discovery, small but deeply unnerving. A newspaper appeared on the property. Not one they subscribed to, not one anyone in the family recognized. It was from Munich. Who had brought it? Why leave it there? It felt like a message, but the meaning was terrifyingly unclear. It was another sign that their isolation wasn't absolute, that someone unknown had breached. Perhaps the most chilling incident before the end came just a day or two before everything went silent. Andreas went to check the tool shed one morning and found the lock tampered with, though nothing appeared to be stolen. He mentioned this to neighbors too, frustration and perhaps fear creeping into his voice. But later that same day, or possibly the next, he confided something even stranger. The house keys, the main set, had vanished. They weren't misplaced. They were gone. Someone could potentially come and go as they pleased. The feeling of safety, already eroded, crumbled further. They were trapped in their own home, potentially with an unseen intruder who now held the keys. Think about that feeling. You're miles from help. Strange things are happening. Footprints appear from nowhere. You hear footsteps above you at night. Objects manifest strangely. Your keys disappear. Every shadow seems to lengthen. Every creak of the floorboards sends a jolt through you. The wind sounds like whispers. You look at your family. See, this is your home, your livelihood. Do you barricade yourselves in? How, when the threat might already be inside, or holds the key to enter? Andreas, it seems, despite his growing alarm, didn't seriously consider leaving. Perhaps pride, perhaps stubbornness, perhaps a grim sense of fatalism. He mentioned the strange happenings, yes, but he didn't seem to convey the sheer panic one might expect. Or maybe he did, and it was simply interpreted as the grumblings of an old farmer. The last day anyone reported seeing any of the Grubers alive was Friday, March 31st, 1922. Young Kazilia had apparently been absent from school for a couple of days. But that wasn't entirely unusual for farm children needed for chores. Neighbors recalled seeing Andreas or Victoria during entirely unusual for farm children needed for chores. Neighbors recalled seeing Andreas or Victoria during the day. Everything seemed normal, or as normal as things could be under the circumstances. Maria Baumgartner, the new maid, arrived that afternoon, stepping into a house already thick with unspoken fear. One can only imagine her thoughts, perhaps trying to dismiss the lingering rumors she might have heard in town. Focusing on the work ahead. Saturday passed, Sunday, Monday. This wasn't entirely unusual either. The Grubers kept to themselves mostly. But by Tuesday, April 4th, concern started to mount. Young Kazilia hadn't shown up for school again. The mail carrier noticed the weekend's mail piling up, untouched. Smoke hadn't been seen rising from the chimney, which was odd for a farmhouse in early spring. A neighbor, Lorenz Schlittenbauer, decided to check on them. He had a connection to the family, Some local gossip even suggested he might be the father of young Joseph, though this was never proven and added another layer of complexity to the small community's dynamics. Schlittenbauer gathered a couple of other men, perhaps his son Johann and stepson Joseph. As they approached Hinterkaifeck, the silence felt heavy, unnatural. The farm animals were making noise, cows lowing, clearly needing to be milked, the dog barking inside the barn. But there was no sign of human activity. The front door was locked. They called out. No answer. Walking around the property, they peered through windows. Nothing seemed amiss. Their unease growing, they decided to force entry, not into the house initially, but into the barn. Perhaps the family was working there. They managed to slide open the large barn door. The scene inside was one of unimaginable horror. There, lying on the hay-strewn floor, were the bodies of Andreas Gruber, his wife Cecilia, his daughter Victoria, and the granddaughter, young Cecilia. They had been brutally murdered. The initial reports suggested they were partially covered with hay. Later investigations determined they'd been struck down with vicious, crushing blows, likely from a mattock, a heavy farming tool, like a pickaxe with one end flattened. The bloodstains told a story of swift, savage violence. The sheer brutality was shocking, but the arrangement was perplexing. It seemed deliberate, almost ritualistic in its horror. Why kill them in the barn? How had they all ended up there? The investigators later theorized, based on the scene, that the killer, or killers, though most believe it was one person, had somehow lured them into the barn one by one, or perhaps in pairs. Maybe Victoria went first, hearing a noise with the animals. Then perhaps her mother, Cecilia, followed when she didn't return. Then Andreas. Then the granddaughter, Cecilia. Each one walking into a trap, meeting a swift and terrible end before the next victim arrived. Imagine the mounting terror if any of them had an inkling of what was happening just moments before their own demise. But the horror wasn't confined to the barn. Schlittenbauer and the others, reeling from their discovery, knew they had to check the house. Had anyone survived? Where was the maid, Maria, and where was the toddler, Joseph? Steeling themselves, they forced entry into the farmhouse. The scene inside deepened the mystery and the revulsion. In her own bedroom, they found the body of the new maid, Maria Baumgartner. She, too, had been killed by massive head trauma, likely from the same mattock. She had barely spent a few hours in the house before meeting her end. And then the final, heartbreaking discovery. In Victoria's bedroom, lying in his cot, was little Joseph. 2 years old, he hadn't been spared. He had been killed in the same brutal manner, struck down in his sleep, or perhaps while crying for his mother. 6 people, an entire family, plus their newly hired help, wiped out. The police were summoned from Munich, about 60 miles away. Inspector Georg Reingruber and his team arrived to a scene that was both horrifying and baffling. The initial discovery had, unfortunately, compromised the crime scene significantly. Neighbors had walked through, touched things, moved bodies slightly in their shock and attempts to see if anyone was alive. But even with this contamination, certain facts became chillingly clear. The murders hadn't happened on Tuesday when they were discovered. Based on the state of the bodies and other evidence, the investigators concluded the killings likely took place on Friday evening, March 31st, the very day Maria Baumgartner arrived, the day the silence began. This meant something profoundly disturbing. Whoever committed these atrocious acts hadn't just killed the family and fled. They had stayed for days. The evidence was undeniable. The farm animals, the cows, the chickens, even the dog found tied up inside the barn, had been cared for. Someone had fed them. Someone had milked the cows. Neighbors later reported seeing smoke from the chimney on Saturday or Sunday, indicating someone had been using the stove. Food had been eaten from the kitchen. Picture this: a person, having just committed 6 brutal murders, calmly remains on the isolated farm. They move among the bodies of their victims, some in the barn, some in the house. They tend to the livestock, light the fire, prepare meals, and sleep in the house, perhaps in one of the beds, for possibly 2 or 3 nights. The level of coldness, the sheer audacity, is almost incomprehensible. What kind of person could do this? The motive was another deep puzzle. Robbery didn't seem to be the primary goal. While the family wasn't wealthy, they likely had some money hidden away, as was common practice. And indeed, a significant amount of cash was later found untouched in the house. Some personal items might have been disturbed, but it wasn't the scene of a frantic ransacking, typical of a robbery gone wrong. This felt personal, targeted. The autopsies confirmed the cause of death for all victims: massive blunt force trauma to the head, consistent with blows from a mattock. One mattock, believed to be the murder weapon, had heard footsteps weeks before. It belonged to the farm. The killer had used the Gruber's own tool against them. Young Kazelia showed signs of strangulation as well, adding another layer of cruelty. Some reports suggested Victoria might have survived the initial attack for several hours, pulling out clumps of her own hair in agony or distress before succumbing. The details are gruesome, but they paint a picture of utter terror and suffering. The investigation began in earnest. Who could have harbored such hatred for the Grubers? Poe possessed the chilling composure to remain at the scene. Suspicion naturally fell on people known to the family. Lorenz Schlittenbauer, the neighbor who led the discovery party, came under scrutiny. His potential relationship with Victoria and fatherhood of Joseph, combined with some perceived oddities in his behavior after the discovery, like disturbing the bodies, made him a person of interest. He vehemently denied any involvement, and no concrete evidence ever tied him to the crime. He even lived in the partially demolished Hinterkaifeck house for a time after the main buildings were torn down years later. A strange choice that only fueled speculation. Karl Gabriel, Victoria's husband, had supposedly died in the trenches of World War I. However, his body was never officially recovered. Whispers persisted. Could he have survived? Could he have returned, perhaps discovering something about Victoria's life, like young Joseph, potentially not his child, that drove him to vengeful fury? Soldiers returning from the war were often deeply traumatized, capable of unpredictable violence. Several people even claimed to have seen Gabriel, or someone resembling him, in the area after the war. But again, no proof ever materialized. He remained officially deceased. Brothers and suspected former lovers of Victoria, the Gump brothers, were also investigated, particularly Adolf Gump, due to known animosity or connections. But alibis and lack of evidence cleared them. Vagrancy was common in post-war Germany. Could it have been a transient, perhaps someone Andreas had argued with or refused shelter? This theory accounted for the footprints from the woods and the killer perhaps needing food and temporary shelter after the act. Nature of the killings, nor the intimate knowledge seemingly required to lure the family members one by one. How would a stranger know the layout, the routines, well enough to orchestrate such a thing? Investigators interviewed over 100 suspects throughout the years. They explored feuds, family secrets, including persistent, dark rumors about Andreas Gruber's relationship with his own daughter Victoria, which had led to a conviction years earlier, and financial disputes. Nothing stuck. The trail always went cold. The case files grew thick with theories, dead ends, and conflicting accounts. Psychics were even consulted, offering visions as cryptic and ultimately unhelpful as the physical evidence. The heads of the victims were removed during the autopsy and sent to Munich for further examination. Perhaps even clairvoyant analysis. In a desperate attempt to find clues, they were reportedly lost during the chaos of World War II, adding another layer of morbid mystery to the tale. The bodies, headless, were buried in Weidhofen. Hinterkaifeck farm itself was demolished in 1923, less than a year after the murders. Perhaps it was an attempt to erase the physical reminder of the horror, to let the land heal. But memories are harder to demolish. The story persisted, passed down through generations, becoming a dark legend in Bavaria and beyond. What makes Hinterkaifeck so profoundly terrifying, even a century later? It's not just the brutality, though that is undeniable. It's the combination of factors. Not just the brutality, though that is undeniable. It's the combination of factors. The isolation, the knowledge that this family was completely cut off, vulnerable, with help miles away. The foreshadowing, those creeping weeks of unease, the footsteps, the keys, the newspaper, signs of an encroaching, unseen threat that the family couldn't escape or perhaps fully comprehend until it was too late. The unknown intruder, the chilling possibility that someone was living secretly within the farmstead itself, perhaps in the attic or barn, observing them, learning their habits, waiting for the right moment. The methodical killer, the cold, calculated nature of the murders, the luring, the use of a familiar farm tool, the baffling aftermath, the killer remaining at the scene, ecology that is deeply disturbing and alien, the enduring mystery, the fact that despite extensive investigations, we still don't know who did it or why. The killer melted back into the world, potentially living out their life, carrying the weight of their secret. It forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about the darkness that can exist beneath the surface of ordinary life, even in the most remote, seemingly peaceful corners of the world. It reminds us that sometimes the most terrifying monsters are not supernatural phantoms, but human beings. The wind still blows over the empty fields where Hinterkaifeck once stood. There's a small memorial there now, a simple marker acknowledging the tragedy. But there are no answers carved in the stone, only the names of the victims and the date their lives were extinguished. The questions hang heavy in the air, unanswered, unsettling. Who walked out of the woods that day? Who wielded the mattock in the dim light of the barn? Who stayed behind, listening to the silence of the dead? We may never know. And perhaps that is the most frightening part of all, the not knowing. The understanding that such darkness can erupt, consume, and then vanish, leaving only scars and whispered stories behind. Thank you for listening, for sharing this space and delving into this deeply unsettling piece of history with me here on Darkling Fables. It's stories like these, rooted in real events, that remind us of the fragility of life and the mysteries that sometimes refuse to be solved. They touch something profound within us, a shared vulnerability perhaps. If this story resonated with you, if it sparked your curiosity or sent a shiver down your spine, please consider giving this video a like. It truly helps the channel grow. And if you haven't already, I'd be honored if you'd subscribe and click that notification bell. We have many more journeys into the shadows planned, exploring true stories and historical mysteries, some just as powerful as this one, maybe even more so. Feel free to share your thoughts or theories about Hinterkaifeck in the comments below. What detail lingers most with you? Let's discuss it respectfully. Thank you again for being here. Until next time,